Morning and welcome to today's evidence session organised by the UK Trade and Business Commission. Today we're looking at framework for future trade deals, a really important part of the work that we are undertaking. And we are extremely grateful to our 6 witnesses this morning for making themselves available to give us the benefit of their views, experience and expertise. And I'm just going to ask each of you to introduce yourselves very briefly and say who you are and where you're from, starting with you, Michael.
Good morning, everybody. So my name is Professor Michael Gasiorek. I'm a trade economist working at the University of Sussex. I'm director of a UK Trade Policy Observatory, which is based at the University of Sussex, and also co-director of a broader research centre, which incorporates universities from across the UK and external stakeholders called the Centre for Inclusive Trade Policy.
Thank you very much indeed. Sally?
Good morning, thank you for having me. I'm Sally Jones. I'm Ernst & Young's trade strategy and Brexit lead, so I spend my time helping companies and governments to understand trade barriers and how they might be mitigated.
Sounds like the work we're doing. Splendid. Marco?
I'm Marco Forgioni. I'm Director General at the Institute of Export and International Trade. The Institute is a professional membership institute and a UK charity founded in 1935 with the express objective of enhancing, supporting, professionalising international trade. And we do that through qualifications, training, advice, guidance, and practical services to support compliant, healthy international trade.
Thank you very much. Claire?
Morning, I'm Claire Gamage. I'm Professor of International Commercial Law at the University of Exeter. My area of specialism is in trade linkages, so looking at the way trade intersects with things like environment, labour standards, gender and human rights. And I come at this very much from sort of a legal focus. So thank you very much for having me today.
Well, thank you. Elitsa?
Good morning, everyone. Dr. Elita Garnizova. I'm the director of the Trade Policy Hub at the London School of Economics. This is a dedicated unit which helps governments and businesses to tackle trade policy and investment-related challenges, but a lot from really coming from an evidence-based perspective and bringing in all of the benefits that the knowledge of the LSE can bring. And I'm also the coordinator of the UAS's Trade Implementation and Enforcement Network, which also tries to bridge the policy gap between policymakers and academics when it comes to trade research.
Thank you very much. And last but not least, Mustafa.
Good morning, everyone. As Hilary mentioned, my name is Mustafa Qadri. I'm a human rights expert and an international lawyer. I run an organization called Equidem, which is a human rights charity, and we do a lot of investigations into the supply chains of British and other multinational businesses.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed. Now, I'm going to put the first question to all 6 of you. So if your answers could be very succinct, that would be helpful. I'd like to know, looking at Britain's trade policy over the last 3 years, so Brexit's happened, but looking at the last 3 years, what would you say have been the successes in terms of trade policy in the last 3 years, and what have not been, or what are the areas where we need improvement? So I'm looking for a pretty short list. And if I could start with you, Sally.
Delighted. So successes. I think there have been some. I think the ones that most immediately come to my mind are the sheer volume of the rollovers, which have ensured that a continuity of trade has been in place. The Trade Remedies Authority, which got set up at very, very short notice and with a comprehensive skill set. And then I think the government has done a decent job at putting some of the fundamental building blocks towards having a trade policy in place. We've got an export strategy, it includes services, we have an investment strategy, quite a lot of the fundamentals are there. If I were to pick a couple of points where I think there are areas for improvement, I would say that there's no strategic linking between the various silos of the policy units that are built up, and that we're sorely lacking as a country having a discussion about where the winners and losers in any trade negotiation should be, so that we then get the inevitability of a sector feeling it's been hard done by because there hasn't been adequate comms across the piece to explain why, as a whole, a particular negotiation or policy area is beneficial for the country. And without that comms and balanced scorecard approach, it's very difficult to evidence why it is that some people will have some things they don't like, whereas others are perfectly happy with the outcome.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Michael.
Thank you. I agree very much with most of, in fact, everything that Sally has just said, and don't have an awful lot to add to that because I think it's very comprehensive. I think that successes are to do with building capacity and expertise within government in order to be able to negotiate and to handle at least free trade deals, if not necessarily broader sets of issues. We've had some modicum of success in signing new free trade agreements, and by new free trade agreements I would probably really only include the agreements with Australia and New Zealand. And whilst they might not yield a big economic benefit, and whilst the challenges of leaving the EU and the barriers that results in the declining trade, aggregate declining trade that results, they're not going to overcome those, that's still a degree of success. There's also been a bit of success, for example, in the UK-US steel dispute in trying to resolve that. So that there have been areas of success. Areas of improvement are clearly I think we need a much clearer articulation of a trade strategy and how it links to an industrial strategy and how it links to everything that Sally was saying about winners and losers, and we currently don't have that. And the other clear area of improvement, which there has been a lot of talk in the press, is to improve economic relations with the EU.
Okay, thank you very much. Can I just ask, the CPTPP, would joining that be a good thing? Or does it depend on the terms?
Well, economically, it's not going to make much difference because
right.
We already have free trade agreements with most of the countries that are part of the CPTPP. So I think the shift towards the CPTPP is much more a geopolitical alignment of the UK as opposed to do with the underlying economics.
Okay, that is very clear. Thank you very much indeed. Now, Sally, I can see your waving hand, but I'm going to get to just through others first. Marco.
Thank you. And I won't repeat because I agree with the huge amount that's being said. Just on Michael's point, I think the CPTPP, as been highlighted, is not going to deliver immediate economic benefit, but I think if you look to the future and a longer term, that there is significant potential for there to be benefit. I think that the move by government to recognise that we need to move at pace to improve our border strategy and to integrate digital trade as a fundamental part of policy is an area both of an acknowledgement of a weakness, but also an attempt now to put that right. And we want to see the target operating model published soon and see the implications of that. I think another area with regards to the conversations, discussions that take place around the negotiations of free trade agreement, I think there could be a lot more to ensure that the voice of business is taken into consideration and is used as part of that negotiation, and a much more regional, national-based input as well to those negotiations. I think those are areas where there are still room for improvement moving forward.
Okay, thank you very much. Claire.
Yeah, in terms of successes to add, I would say that I've been really impressed with the way the government departments have really reached out to external stakeholders to engage them in terms of sort of understanding what policy means and what it could look like. So engagement with academics, with civil society organisations, I think has been really impressive over the past 3 years. In terms of where I think there's room for improvement, I've been quite alarmed by this apparent shift away from rights-informed trade policy in the past 2 years in particular. I think there's room for improvement in the impact assessment that seems to be carried out pre-free trade negotiation. And there is an alarming lack of consideration of real key issues. For example, we can talk about the Australia FTA as a relative success for the UK. If you look at the strategic impact assessment, there's no mention of Indigenous persons in that FTA impact assessment. So I think that question around silos is really important. And will the silos between the departments lead to policy incoherence at a time when we're trying to create policy coherence in international trade strategy?
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Elisa.
Great. I definitely second everything said so far, especially on the on the successes. I would add the digital space. So in the digital realm, I think that the UK has done very well in trying to understand what are the challenges when it comes to the barriers to trade in the digital space, and trying to dedicate capacity to that, and trying to work through different levels of engagement at the bilateral level and multilateral level to deal with those issues. And of course, one of those is the digital economy agreement with Singapore, which is a really good example of this. I would also say that in terms of their engagement with an evidence-based approach and trying to bring across all areas of trade policy making, and trying to really build areas around market access, around digitalization, again, having that evidence base to build on. And on the improvements front, I would say for me, the big topics are moving away slightly from trade itself, but the linkages to national security, particularly economic coercion, the climate transformation. So these are topics that have become a lot more prominent in the trade policies and the trade policy engagement of other countries and our key trading partners. And I feel that we need to do some catching up when it comes to those. I would definitely point out to national security and climate as a two big need things to be strengthened.
That's great. Thank you very much. Mustafa.
Yeah, so just very briefly, I mean, I echo what others have spoken about in terms of human rights, but in terms of the successes, well, 12 out of 38 of the free trade agreements signed in 2021 contain labor protections, and 2, for example, Vietnam and Japan, actually include quite a wide raft of fundamental conventions and human rights treaties, as well as the really key business and human rights guidelines and standards. So that's a really, really great thing. In terms of areas of improvement, I mean, I think those are actually still quite significant. And by that, in a nutshell, there's obviously quite a bit more to it than this, but 26 of the 38 FTAs that have been signed or in negotiation in terms of human rights as well. So that's quite significant. In terms of the messaging going beyond those signed agreements are the ones that are quite advanced. It's very clear that the government is not prioritising human rights. And as other speakers have said, that integration of the strategy across the board on rights and also on climate change is really limited. So there is some reference to climate change. But I'll give you a really simple example. The Gulf states, obviously very resource rich, really key trade partners, are also per capita the biggest contributors to what is destroying our planet in terms of climate change. And if you look at the United Arab Emirates, they will often talk about, rightly, the need to transition. They're really ahead of the curve in terms of really building that sector. That's really great. But at the same time, they're actually increasing their oil and gas production in general. So there really needs to be, with the leverage of these trade negotiations, a real focus on that. I mean, the way to look at it, apart from these negatives, these concerns, it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity for British leadership, but also to really bed in. Because ultimately, when it comes to international relations, as everyone knows, trade is a really key part of that. It's the key way in which it's the engine room through which, we build relationships, but also we can build leverages for soft power around things like human rights. Okay,
that is really helpful. Now, Sally, very quickly, you wanted to come back and then we'll move on.
Yeah, on your CPTPP question, and I just wanted to pick up on Alan's point about how we already have free trade agreements with a number of the parties, which is absolutely correct. However, what my clients are finding is that it's quite beneficial for them to be able to look at both provisions side by side, because there are places where CPTPP is more beneficial than the FTA or vice versa. So they've now got a range of market access options rather than just one. Of course, that adds complexity too, because they've got to do the side-by-side comparison. But it's not entirely obvious that the two are exactly overlapping.
Okay, that is really helpful. Thank you all very much for that. Right, I'm now going to turn to Alison Williams.
Thank you. Hi, good morning. So my question is, do you think that the UK has a satisfactory trade strategy, and particularly are its priorities aligned with economic and social progress? So I'd like to go to Claire and Mustafa first, and then we can open up and see if anyone else wants to contribute. Thank you.
Thank you. So my personal view is that the UK government is articulating a strategy that seems to be evolving, and I'm not sure that it's evolving in the direction that I would have hoped that it would have done. But there seems to be, over the past 2 years in particular, and my interest really is in the human rights sort of area of trade policy, and the way that human rights link in with environment and climate change, and the way they link in with labour standards and gender, for example. What has happened is the political rhetoric has changed completely from saying we absolutely will have human rights as part of our trade policy to now saying that human rights will no longer form part of the free trade agreements, and they will form part of the political dialogue that sits alongside those trade agreements. Now, on the one hand, that might not sound problematic, and there is a big debate around whether human rights should be in trade agreements in the first place. But as Mustafa has said, actually, trade is a really powerful sort of mechanism to mobilize change in different countries. Where we can see quite an alarming shift, I think, for example, is if we look in the context of generalized system of preferences and unilateral preference schemes. For example, the US actually suspended concessions to Cameroon because of human rights abuses that were being reported through 2020 onwards. The EU and the UK have not since suspended their concessions with that country or changed their trading patterns with that country. And the question there really, as I've raised before, is what does the UK want its trade policy to look like? And what it appears to be to me at the moment is that the UK is really pushing forward on climate initiatives. We're seeing that through specific financial kind of mechanisms, saying we want sort of finance, green finance. And my question is, where are the rights-based analyses that are going with how that finance could actually then affect communities elsewhere? I think that point that was raised earlier about linking up the external and the internal, how does our external trade policy feed into the domestic industrial strategies? That to me is really lacking at the moment. And let's not forget, human rights is a concern in the UK as well. How is the industrial strategy affecting social progress in the UK? That's a really important question we need to address. So for me at the moment, I would say that UK trade policy is evolving in a way that I think could be quite harmful to human rights, and quite harmful, not just in terms of its external relations, but potentially internally as well.
Thank you. Mustafa?
Thanks, Alison. Just to say, firstly, entirely agree with everything Claire said really eloquently, and really just to emphasize that there seems to be, I think, a perception at the moment that there's a real need, obviously, to be building these trade relations. Obviously, the economy is weak, and therefore, perhaps, I could be wrong, a bit of a short-termism going in, which I think misunderstands just how essential respect for human rights, labor rights, in a way that actually is an obligation in these treaties, can really make a difference, both obviously as a leverage point, but also to remember that, with, for example, the Gulf region, with India, for example, other countries as well, of course, but these are very active negotiations. Yes, these are huge markets. And of course, we want to have access to these markets. It's very good for our economy. But there are a lot of services, products that are made or provided for in the UK that these markets really want. There is a leverage that we want to actually use, but human rights and labor rights are really integrated into that. And a really simple example of that is obviously things like the modern slavery legislation, or British companies, if they're setting up in a place like Saudi Arabia, will your staff be comfortable working in a country where you can literally, as a woman, go to jail for complaining about the fact that your rights aren't respected, or that you're treated as a minor when you're actually, an adult, or that when it comes to India, there are significant issues around the rights of minorities or freedom of expression. And at the same time, if you look at the public discourse, you're having these actors trying to invest in British sport. There's a lot of governments or companies linked to certain regimes investing in our sporting events. You know, we cover the Qatar World Cup quite extensively, and it was quite significant to see people that don't normally talk about human rights and labor rights really asking those sorts of questions. What's really interesting is that, you know, the Gulf region, the GCC, which is the umbrella organization for the 6 Gulf states, failed. The negotiations for trade agreements with the EU failed because the EU refused to budge on their policy of including human rights conditions. And that's a significant thing. There's an opportunity there that's really being lost. So that's just one thing I'd add to what Claire's also said.
That's great, thank you. Would anybody else like to add anything before we move on to the next question? Yeah, Michael.
Yeah, I think a lot of those answers are focused very much on the issue of trade and human rights, and I'm very sympathetic to a lot of what has been said. But I'd also say I think it's one of the trickiest areas, or it's a very, very tricky area when thinking about what is the appropriate role of trade policy with regard to human rights. And I think we probably do need to have more evidence on this and more of, if you like, a national conversation about what it is that we want and what are the acceptable parameters for trading with countries. The actual evidence on whether introducing clauses on human rights and free trade agreements makes a difference to what partner countries do is actually very limited and fairly mixed. There is not a lot of evidence that those provisions necessarily work. Similarly, with regard to the GSP provisions. So in its reform of the GSP in September, the UK dropped its requirement for certain categories of countries to meet certain provisions with regard to, for example, workers' rights and human rights and so on. And one of the reasons for doing that was that there was limited evidence that in the schemes that the UK was previously part of, for example, under the EU, that these had any negligible impact on those particular policies in those countries.
Okay, and just on that, so is it a complete lack of evidence rather than the evidence suggesting that they're not impactful? It's actually we just need to do more research and understand how impactful they are.
It's a bit of both. So the evidence, there is evidence out there, and it doesn't really show that there has been much impact.
Okay, thank you. Claire, you raise your hand and then
if I could just say very quickly, I think one key difference that we're seeing in the shift away from the EU position, which is, you know, rights informed at the very least, is that we've lost a level of scrutiny that existed at the EU level through their institutional framework, including the European Parliament. The European Ombudsman, just before Christmas, issued a report around the failings of the European Commission to take sufficient account of the ways in which trade can interact with human rights. And so whilst I completely agree with Michael in terms of it's very difficult to measure the impact and sometimes the results are very mixed, we are shifting away and making quite a considerable shift away from where we were previously, and we've lost that level of scrutiny.
Okay, we've got 2 hands up. Chair, have we got time to go for a minute more?
Very quick, yes.
Yeah,
sure.
Thank you. Okay, sorry, I'm not sure who was first. Elisa, do you want to go?
I think it was Mustafa, but I'll be super quick. We actually did a study exactly on that. So, and I can share the link in the chat box. It's more about, for me, I would say it's a lot more about implementation and enforcement. And of course, the domestic factors from that point of view matter a lot, and how you structure an FTA, how you structure its implementation in terms of the joint committees, it's a key factor here. So while the evidence is mixed, we do already know what are the success factors or more of the good practices when it comes to the linkages between trade and the environment, trade and labor, and trade and human rights. There is now a lot more on this. So I think that we are definitely Claire is on the point with that one.
Thank you. Okay, Mustafa, do you want to close this one?
Yeah, no, thank you. And I'll be really quick, just to really echo everything that has been said before. I mean, obviously, it is very challenging. The data is very mixed. Partially, of course, it's very hard to show impacts in terms of human rights, but it is what others said, is it's not just about trade agreements. They're not a panacea, but it's also about all the things that happen after that. But one thing also to really emphasize, it's a really important point. Human rights and labor rights are actually often about really practical things. If you're producing medical gloves, you know, yes, the labor rights of your workers, but is it done in a safe and sanitary, you know, workplace? That can have an impact on people that use those medical gloves in the United Kingdom. Do workers go on strike because they don't have social protection? All those sorts of things. So, in fact, the way that you might measure it, although it's very challenging, might be in ways that don't traditionally be viewed as human rights or labour rights. So, yes, absolutely. It's not a panacea, but it's a really critical initial building block for building in human rights respect in UK's foreign relations.
Great, thank you. And thank you for sharing the link, Lisa. I'll hand back to the chair.
Alison, thank you very much indeed. Charles, over to you.
Morning. My question is about the global trade politics and how government reflects that in the work that's being done. So the question is the UK government taking sufficient account of changes in global trade politics, such as the moves away from globalization? And I'd like to direct that question initially to Michael and then to Alicia.
Thank you. I guess the first thing I would say is I'm not sure that I would say that we have a move away from globalization. I think it's more that we have a shift to a different form of globalization. We're not quite sure quite the direction it's heading, but I don't think we're moving away from globalization. I think the changes in global trade politics, in terms of the question, are that global trade politics are becoming much, much more interventionist than they were even year, 2, 3 years ago. And this is on all sorts of grounds that countries are increasingly intervening on trade. National security is often touted as a reason, and it's used perhaps as a bit of a catch-all. Economic security, and we see an introduction of policies by the US, EU, and so on with regard to technology, notably semiconductors, green technologies, the IRA Act, and the EU's response last week, the green subsidies, regulations, and so on. And it's also to do with supply chain resilience. So there's a lot more intervention taking place by countries. They're much more prepared to intervene than they were before, to intervene on grounds of national security, social supply chain resilience, and to try and build competitiveness in certain sectors. It really isn't clear to me how the UK is responding to those areas. I think the UK can't possibly hope to compete in a subsidy race with the US or the EU. That's not the appropriate policy response. And Secretary of State for Trade, indicated that in an interview this week or last week and so on. And I do agree with that. But nevertheless, we are facing quite a challenging and interventionist policy environment, which the UK, it's not clear to me how the UK is responding to that, and I think it needs to.
Thank you. That's interesting. Alicia?
Yeah, to really elaborate on Michael's point, it is, I fully agree that this focus on global supply chains, supply chain resilience, especially in high priority sectors, is one of the areas which we can definitely put here. And I think that the UK government's approach has definitely evolved. There has been work going on critical raw materials, supply chain resilience for sure. So this is very much in the right direction. One of the also areas of sort of improvement is how we, again, this is the point of linking internal and external policy. And firstly, on sort of what will be the demands in the UK because of the climate transformation. So what will be our needs as a nation to move to net zero? And what would that be in terms of the demands of critical raw materials? And how do we reflect that in our trade strategy and in our FTAs? So this is one of the things that we can definitely be more proactive about linking. How do we make linkages with energy and raw materials in trade agreements and what we need? And the second point is really the challenge of dealing with China. So I think that this is one of the areas which will be very difficult for the UK to tackle this year and over the next years. It's really how it's going to position itself next to the US, which has in terms of its policy motives, it has really turned to reaction to China and responding to China as one of its main sort of reasons to act in a certain way, and then alongside the EU, which is also undecided in certain areas. But there is a lot to talk about, again, economic coercion that we've seen towards Taiwan, towards Australia, towards other allies, also in terms of the government subsidies that Michael mentioned. So for me, these are some of the additions on the changes that we have to respond to.
Thank you. Does anybody else want to contribute on this point? Yes, we've got Sally.
Thank you. Just a couple of very quick points. The first is that we haven't yet had the long-awaited government semiconductor strategy published, and we haven't had the long-awaited carbon border adjustment mechanism policy updated. We really need those out as soon as possible because we're falling behind our global competition on those 2 points. Second is that when we ask the government to respond on geopolitics, I think we have to draw a distinction between short-term crises and long-term trends, because it takes any one of my clients a good 2 years to react to a geopolitical change from end to end. So expecting the government to factor that into its calculations and its policies is very difficult. Long-term trends we need to be taking into account. Short-term trends, it's more about an immediate reaction than necessarily a policy directional change.
Thank you. Marco, please.
Yeah, I was going to make the Sally's point exactly about how you respond to an immediate crisis or issue and how you deal with those longer-term trends. And I think that the government hasn't really had a comprehensive integrated strategy with regards to how we deal with trade. Sally's mentioned we've got an export strategy, but we don't have an import strategy. We're not really linking any of that with a broader industrial strategy or a sense of where our priority industries are and what the reshaping of the supply chain globally is going to mean for the UK. So I think that there seems to be a recognition that the changes that were made recently, I think, are positive, but we need to see much more focus on a comprehensive approach to industrial and trade processes, procedures.
Yeah, thank you very much. I must say that I've noticed in my own energy area that the collapse of the British Volt factory in Blyth in Northumberland and the way in which it's been auctioned off, I think is I fear that it lacks a strategic background because we're going from one small company to another. And I wonder whether this is going to deliver the security of supply chain. Please.
Sorry, just to come back on that really well-made point, linking our trade strategy and our imports, exports, we need also to look at our FDI approach and how we are ensuring that we are generating and encouraging the right sort of investment in strategically important infrastructure and industrial sectors.
Yeah, exactly, because without the battery plant, there's going to be no motor trade. Please, Michael.
Thank you. I just wanted to add to that, and I agree, very much agree with those comments and well-made comments that were made. And I think that part of this absence of a sort of coherent industrial and trade strategy, which I think we do need, should also think carefully about the sectors, not just the conditions, be this to do with innovation and infrastructure, but thinking about where do we want to be, where do we see ourselves in 5-10 years' time, what are the key priority sectors and what are the current problems in those sectors or emerging problems. And car batteries is clearly going to be a major issue for the UK automobile industry, which is a key manufacturing industry within the UK, and is really thinking about what are the barriers to investment, what are the barriers to trade, and how can trade policy support that. Trade policy is never going to be the answer, but trade policy can support the transition and the emerging challenges that we face.
Thank you very much for that, Michael. Can I pass this back to the chair?
Charles, thank you very much indeed. Alan Winters, over to you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Hilary, and thanks to the panel for being here. I guess in a sense I want to continue the previous conversation, but just to sort of ask, do you feel that the free trade agreements that the UK has entered into over the last few years are delivering for UK policy priorities. For instance, about the services sector, perhaps also about human rights or environment, carbon policy, and so on. So sort of rather more specific version, I guess, of where we've been talking previously. Mustafa, why don't I start with you?
Yeah, it's a really, really great question. And again, I'd say that from a human rights, labor rights perspective, it's very hard to measure that in empirical terms. But I think it's very clear, as I noted earlier, that a very strong signal has been sent that human rights, labor rights won't be prioritized in trade negotiations. In part, also, there has been messaging around this desperation to trade relations we used to have with the European Union with other partners. And so that has actually led to the situation where, for example, even a country like, say, Vietnam or Japan, or in some respects, Australia, New Zealand, have actually often been showing leadership in some aspects of human rights and labor rights in those negotiations. But when it comes to very significant partners like, say, India and the Gulf states, those things have not had an impact. And you see impacts in simple ways, such as even British nationals, when they're facing challenges in those countries, feeling that they're not actually getting the kind of support from their government, a sense that, in fact, that those governments can actually, or actors in those countries can get away with certain treatment. As I mentioned before, it seems like a rather spurious thing to mention, but these football clubs that are, either already have been purchased by, effectively highly invested, private entities or sovereign wealth funds, which are effectively state institutions, in my opinion, or their interest in them. Not only are these really significant social capital, there's a lot of social capital in these, in these enterprises, but they're really big companies. And so I think that, again, it's very hard to measure empirically. But also, of course, when you work in human rights, you are inherently optimistic in the way that you think about things. And the thing I would say is there are still many trade relations that negotiations that are on foot. As others have mentioned, it's very hard to say for sure whether, having those provisions in a trade agreement itself leads to improvement in human rights, and whether, of course, those two things should be linked. And so I think there are some lessons that should be learned. And again, what I'd say is, part of that is messaging, part of that is the practicality, is about talking about human rights and labor rights in terms that are, obviously talking about values and principles, but also functionality, how they are relevant to better business relationships. You saw that, and I'll end on this point, during the COVID crisis, there was no coincidence that often the most significant breakdowns in supply chains, of course, that was an issue around the world, not just in one region or one country, but those breakdowns typically were the worst in countries with very weak, for example, labor protection, or where, for example, trade union rights were very limited. And so that meant that, in fact, the supply chains were very vulnerable to those kinds of shocks. So I think it is very important that not everyone will have that kind of sympathy to the human rights, labor rights arguments around trade, but there's a very practical reason why. So in short, I think there have been an impact. Very hard to measure that, but rather than us, we can moan about that. I'd love to do that, but looking forward, what can we learn from those experiences over the last 3 years?
Okay, thank you. Very interesting suggestion. I'd really be interested to follow up the numbers on supply chains and sort of trade union representation.
Yeah, as would I. I think it's a really important part of research to do on that.
I thought you were sitting on a pile of data. Sally, can I turn to you? Perhaps a different perspective.
Thank you. I was itching to jump in. So I would like, if I may, to pick up on services trade, which we all know is a fundamental part of the UK economy, where services exports are becoming increasingly important. And I think it's fascinating to see how in this area, the UK is actually pretty ambitious for comprehensive services chapters in its free trade agreements, certainly more ambitious than the global average would be. So ticks all round there. The problem, I think, is that the services trade has moved on considerably from the standards that were set out at the WTO in the Global Agreement on Trade and Services in 1994 from memory, and that all FTAs, including the UK's FTAs, are still perhaps 10 years out of date. We see things in, for example, the India negotiations. And India, of course, has never signed a free trade agreement with a services chapter. So at best, we're trying to go a little bit beyond India's GATS commitments, which are radically different from services chapters in say, the Australia-New Zealand agreements, or indeed the Singapore Digital Agreement. So on services, I think the ambition is absolutely right, but there's more that could be done to align the policy with the UK's economic reality.
Okay, thank you very much. Does anybody else want to add a bit on that? Yeah, Marco.
So I think that Sally's point is a really important one, and I think that we sometimes overlook the fact that trade and services supports manufacturing as well, with the servicification of the manufacturing sector, making sure that we've got comprehensive services included in our free trade agreements is really important. Looking practically as to the question whether they are delivering the benefits, we undertook a webinar with 500 of our business members at the end of last year around the free trade agreements, and it's clear that there's a real lack of understanding amongst businesses as to what it means for them and how they can seize the opportunities that the free trade agreements offer. And we see that in real time because there's a poor take-up of the opportunities that exist around the free trade agreement. So I think that they have the potential to deliver economic benefit, to deliver business opportunities, but the business community is really struggling to understand how they use them or understand what the implications of those free trade agreements are. So I think there's a significant piece of work that needs to be done around that education, information, and support around the free trade agreements.
Claire.
Yeah, thank you. Just two quick points. One, to build on what Marco's just said, something that the EU has done that it's done quite well is to create tools, online tools for businesses to be able to access and to see what preference can they access and what rule of origin would they have to satisfy and what that actually means in practice. And developing that kind of practical policy-based tool could really help micro and small, medium-sized enterprises to use FTAs. It's not just large corporations using them. The other point I was going to make is that I think that there needs to be a greater understanding around the intersections between global value chains and FTAs, the way they work with one another, against one another. Mentoring, British Vault is a good example of sort of supply chain awareness. They had a big investment from Glencore. Glencore mines in the Congo and is well recognized as a human rights violator in the Congo for the way it mines its cobalt. So although we're told that it's a sustainable relationship, there are question marks around that. So this understanding between the way supply chains work in the context potentially of FTAs or outside of FTAs, the way finance is linked to trade, the way that investment is linked to trade, I think these are the sorts of things we need a greater awareness of if we want to build, a really coherent trade policy.
Okay, thank you. Michael.
Thank you. I have a comment and in part also sort of a reverse question. So my comment is, if you like, the question that you've asked us here is, are the free trade agreements UK has entered into delivering UK policy priorities? And I think it's important to be realistic here that the extent to which a free trade agreement can actually deliver, in particular free trade agreement with a country that's very, very far away, such as Australia and New Zealand, and has a small share of our trade, the extent to which it can deliver just in terms of the actual magnitudes involved is going to be small. The second caveat I would raise is that what these free trade agreements can deliver depends very much on what the partner countries are prepared to agree to. And in many cases, the UK's negotiating position is not necessarily very strong, again, because of the economic importance of that trading relationship. So it's easy to criticize, for example, given agreements that they didn't achieve very much, but we can have a long list of demands, but it depends on the other party wanting to accede to those demands, and that's not so obvious. And then my question, which is really, I guess, back to Sally, which is on the services provisions, and I'm really not a services trade expert, but my understanding of many of the sorts of agreements that we've signed, New Zealand, Australia, Japan, and so on, is actually the degree of services liberalisation is not that great. So while I agree that the ambition is high, the amount that's actually been liberalised is really largely locking in existing unilateral liberalisations as opposed to further liberalisation, except for, there are some areas, financial services or international maritime transport in the Australia Agreement, but by and large, it's kind of locking in what countries have agreed to do anyway. Now, that shouldn't be underestimated. That locking in is potentially very, very important because it provides certainty, but I'm not sure how much has actually been achieved in terms of further liberalisation.
Sally, do you want to? Yes, please do.
Very briefly, Michael is touching on one of my absolute bugbears, which is the implementation of negotiated deals as opposed to the actual negotiation of them. Often in services chapters, one finds provisions based around best endeavours, or certainly non-binding commitments, which is deeply frustrating. And if we were to take the UK-Canada Free Trade Agreement, which is a rollover of the EU-Canada Free Trade Agreement, there are some absolutely outstanding provisions around the mutual recognition of professional qualifications, but all of them are on a binding best endeavours, non-binding best endeavours basis. And to the best of my knowledge, there hasn't been a single professional qualification that has yet been mutually recognised 5 years on, because it's not been prioritised. It should be, but it's not.
Okay, thank you. I had a supplementary question on this, which in a sense was, the UK government has, what should we say, stressed the speed of doing these agreements. And I wonder whether you feel that has sort of compromised their ability to persuade other countries to come, as it were, to where we want to be. And whether or not that's the case, whether that informs our strategy for the negotiations that are going on. We've got quite a number that are going on now, renegotiations or new ones. Elitsa, I don't know whether you want to start off on that.
Hi, thanks, Alan. That's a really good follow-up question. I think it matters a lot in terms of, also we know that publicly tying your hands to a specific deadline is problematic, both for your internal constituency, but also externally for your trading partner. And not so much for the signed ones, but I definitely see it as a constraint with India coming forward. Mustafa mentioned the GCC, even slightly the CPTPP deadline that has been set by the UK government itself to fulfill within a certain time limit, because especially just to start with the India one, we know that there are gains on both sides from potential agreement. But just like with any other FTA, signing an FTA is a precedent for future engagement with other countries. Once this is on paper, that means that other countries can request the same or can decide not to give you more than what you have given the specific partner. And of course, I think that everybody's aware that India is a tough negotiator, that it has a specific set of concerns that are there, but especially when the negotiations kicked in, my biggest hope was, let's not rush this, because there are clear business gains on both sides. And these are well documented across taxes, technical requirements, standards, intellectual property, everything that you could think of on behalf of UK businesses. But we are back to what Mustafa said, but what about human rights? But what about the environmental goals that we set ourselves as a nation? So we don't want to definitely rush to complete a deadline with the idea that we might be making it very problematic to agree on those things that we feel that are important for the UK and for not just for businesses but also for consumers.
Yeah, thanks. Sally, or Sally's cat, perhaps.
Sorry, he's a pain sometimes. You can have a fast deal, you can have a broad deal, or you can have a good deal, but you can't have all three.
Right, there we are. We'll make a note of that. Thanks very much. That sums that up a lot. Marco.
Just to reinforce that point, the problem, the real challenge of setting a false deadline is that the rush then is to get the signature done, to get the piece of paper signed. And we miss the sense of how are we going to make sure that the FTA is communicated effectively and then utilised, and separately, we miss the point of ensuring that our systems, processes, and procedures are aligned between the nations, which again creates a problem for that utilisation. So setting a deadline, we would firmly urge against.
Yeah, and Claire.
Yeah, thank you. At the beginning of the session, most of us raised the fact that actually there appear to be incoherences or inconsistencies in the UK's trade policy. And so the idea that you would rush to conclude a trade agreement when you're actually not yet clear on your own trade strategy, I think is really quite concerning. The other point to make is that when negotiating a trade agreement, that the best deal will come if you have consultation with different stakeholders throughout that process. And that goes back to Marco's original point. You have to bring businesses in and bring in those stakeholders of who's going to benefit from that, and bring in other organizations as well. So I think a good deal will come from taking time to establish what your priorities actually are, and having consultation around what those priorities are and should be for the short term and the long term.
Okay, thank you. That's all very useful. So I'm afraid I had the next question as well. So if I can carry on, Hilary. A sort of change of focus in a sense. We've just been talking about forthcoming trade agreements, really. But as one of you commented, we've got 38 of the things already. I mean, do you think that the government is implementing these sufficiently carefully? And also, do you think there's enough monitoring and measurement of the results going on? Marco, I don't know if you want to start with this.
Thank you. Are they being used sufficiently? No. Is there enough understanding amongst business over how they can utilise the free trade agreements and the terms of them? No. And we've evidence of that, as I say, both from our members, the wider trading community, and the statistics that show that they're not really being utilised. It is, however, early days, so there is time, but it is going to take a really concerted effort across the totality of government to ensure that we get things right on the policy side internally in order to make use of our trade agreements. And a lack here, it's been stated before, but it is relevant, is that there has to be a clear link up between our industrial strategy, our export strategy, our import strategy, and what we are hoping for with regards to the UK economy in the future. And only when we've got that central coherence are we really going to see the benefits of any of the free trade agreements.
Okay, thank you. Sally.
I suppose my point here is, what are we supposed to be measuring in terms of the impact of our existing deals? The Australia and New Zealand deals aren't fully implemented yet. The Japan deal is marginal at best because it's essentially a rollover, as are all of the others. The Singapore digital agreement is a digital agreement, and we know that the services data is pretty rubbish anyhow because it's difficult to collect. So we can't really measure their impact on a global basis because there is as yet nothing to measure. What we would argue, I think, is that we do need proper impact assessments done in due course so that we can, once they've had a chance to bed in, understand exactly what their impact is. I mean, the reality is, though, that implementing trade deals is boring and turgid technical grind on the whole, and we're going through that process right now.
Okay, or not, as the case may be. Elitsa.
Yeah, I was going to second Claire on particularly on the impact assessments as a baseline that we are then going to be using in order to see against what we expected the impact of an agreement would be, what has actually come to fruition and what not, whether there have been any unintended consequences, which is usually what we want to look at when we do such types of evaluations and ex post after an agreement has been implemented. And I just wanted to say that I think that this is actually 2023 is supposed to be a crucial year with the IT publishing its strategy last year. So it's really working on building the capacity to do this. And from personal experience, it takes so much time and so much resources to actually do proper evaluations. I mean, not even to talk about the monitoring and the implementation, just an evaluation itself for a large agreement, which is between two parties with such a broad coverage as most of the agreements are. It's a very expensive process, and it requires a lot of capability and skill. So that just means also how the UK government works with also external organizations and sets out its actual agenda and priorities to how these are going to be evaluated.
Okay, thank you. Michael.
Thank you. I agree that for the new agreements, it's by and large too early to do any sort of comprehensive assessment. The agreements with Australia and New Zealand, well, Australia was signed in December of last year, December 21, New Zealand, February 2022. So it's too early to do an impact assessment. I guess one could do an assessment of Japan, for example, because that was following on from the agreement with the EU, which was 2019. But what I think ought to be in place is mechanisms for undertaking assessments X years after an agreement, and that is part of what DIT, or whatever the new department is called or going to be called, is required to do. So, for example, I mean, they have this, for example, in Korea, that 5 years after the implementation of an agreement, there has to be an evaluation of that agreement. The other thing that I think would be very useful to have is on an annual basis is a report on the state of play on the free trade agreements that the UK has signed. So the US has this. It produces an annual report which says, these are the issues that arose. This is how we tried to resolve them. These are the ongoing areas of discussion between us. I think it would be very, very useful to have an annual report that says where we are with regard to the negotiation. And then not negotiation, sorry, on the agreements themselves. And finally, just with regard to the point that was made a minute ago, which is that doing evaluations is quite complicated, but there are also some fairly standardized techniques for doing those evaluations. And one could put those into place and say, look, we understand the limitations of these techniques, but on a regular basis, we will do some ex post evaluations of what has been the impact on exports and on imports and on trade generally.
Okay, Claire.
Yes, thank you. Just to add to that, I absolutely endorse everything that's been said already. You know, the domestic advisory groups are already meeting on some of the agreements. So, you know, Japan, Canada, the Andean community. So at least there is some discussion beginning to take place around, you know, consultation of how those agreements are being implemented. One of the biggest challenges, of course, is data disaggregation, data collection on key indicators, I suppose. But as Michael says, there are standard sets of indicators and metrics that we can use to measure implementation in certain aspects. I think one thing we can certainly learn from the EU experience is if we looked, for example, at the 5-year and then the 10-year review of the EU Cariform Economic Partnership Agreement, concerns that were flagged in the 5-year strategic review were not then addressed for the 10-year strategic review. So by the time the 10-year report was published, it had all of the problems from the 5-year with some more added on from the 10-year. So if we're going to do these kind of implementation exercises, it has to be meaningful, and there has to be this kind of approach that Michael's mentioned with the US, where you say, what was the problem and what did you do about it? Not just this kind of, you know, action that we're doing, so when actually in reality we're not doing anything at all.
Okay, thank you very much. It's all music to my ears. It means lots and lots of resources for people like us to do evaluations. Of course, it would be thoroughly useful. So thank you very much. Very useful. Let me pass back to Hilary.
Alan, thank you very much indeed. Right, next to Stephen Farry.
Okay, thank you very much, Hilary, and good morning, everyone. And could I ask, is the UK government giving sufficient focus to trade policy tools in addition to FTAs, such as market access cases, and also global institutional rules? And also, has the government approach to trade remedies been appropriate? So not quite sure who wants to field that, if any hands want to come and volunteer. Yeah, okay, Sally, first up. Thank you.
go on then, if you insist. So I think we've done some interesting and good work, but there's more to be done. So again, where there are successes, I think, are around our work at the WTO, where certainly at the 12th ministerial last summer, so summer 2022, the UK was right at the heart of some of the most important discussions. And we've continued to be an active player across several of the working groups and joint committees. So on that point, the global institutional rules, I think the UK is doing a decent job. On trade remedies, I think we need a conversation about what we actually want our trade remedies policy to be. Is it overtly political? Is it deliberately apolitical? Is there some other approach we want to take? And in terms of market access cases, and indeed trade remedies, I'm not convinced that British business in particular has understood quite the extent to which the landscape has changed, and that there may be opportunities for challenge that hadn't previously existed before, and more work around that from a comms and engagement perspective would be really useful.
And over to you, Claire, next, please. Thanks.
Very much, Stephen, and thank you very much to our witnesses so far. I think, can you hear me, Stephen?
Oh, sorry, Claire. Yes. No, I thought it was Claire, one of the witnesses. Sorry.
Oh no, that's fine. I'll hand back to you.
Too many Claires in the room. That's
I
the problem.
I know. It's wonderful.
No, I'm happy to pass on this one. Don't worry. I would just echo what Sally has already said. I think the key thing is around educating businesses as to what's available and what might have changed. As I've said before, with some of the smaller businesses in particular, navigating this new landscape is really challenging. And I do actually think the government departments have done a considerable amount of work to try to educate alongside, other consultancy firms. But there is a real lack of understanding. When we speak to people in the Southwest who are small businesses, they have really very little understanding sometimes of what they may be able to do. So I just think it's an education point and a dissemination point, but in a language, in a vernacular, and using tools that is understandable to those people.
Thank you very much, Claire. Claire, our witness, that is. And we look forward to Claire, the Commissioner, shortly.
Claire with no E, Claire with an E. That's how you can remember it.
And over to Marco next, and then Michael, then Elisa. So Marco, please.
To echo Claire's point, making sure that we have an engagement program that isn't just across the full spectrum of businesses, also covers the regional and regions and nations. It is going to be essential to making sure that the understanding is there. To Sally's point, the TRA has been brilliantly set up and is a great initiative, but I think we're beginning to see now a real challenge over what their role actually is and how they're going to undertake their work, whether there is that political element to it or it is purely factually based. I think that needs to be brought out and clarified very quickly. I think that there's a wider piece as well, which is around interoperability of systems and alignment, particularly with regards to the mutual recognition and equivalence piece that also I think is lacking from some of the negotiations and the engagement and certainly the implementation.
Thanks. And over to Michael.
Sorry, I'm not following you at all.
Thank you. So on this issue of sort of trade policy tools in addition to FTAs and global institutional rules, I agree with what Sally said earlier. Yes. I would add to that, however, that in a sense, what that question reflects is the fact that trade policy is not just about free trade agreements. There's other aspects of trade policy that governments need to engage in with international partners. And while we may have engaged positively in various ways in the WTO, there are other areas where perhaps the UK could do more. So, for example, the UK is not part of the MPIA, the multi-party interim arbitration panel for dealing with disputes and things, and I think that's a shame. I think the UK could be part of that, and that could help to resolve disputes that may arise. I think there are issues around carbon taxes and how trade and climate interface with each other, and what the UK's role is on that, and how it interacts with other countries and talks to other countries as to what the solutions to this might be. This is not something that can be easily resolved through bilateral free trade agreements. This is an international problem that requires international coordination. So I think there is more that the UK could do, probably in engaging with sort of plurilateral solutions, as opposed to sort of the, strictly speaking, multilateral WTO or the more bilateral FTA solutions.
Thanks, Michael. And over to Elita.
Just to wrap up, a very minor comment. I think that one of the things that has for sure improved, and we have seen sort of a lot of work being done in that respect, is the evidence-based approach to market access barriers, to their measurement, trying to assess their impact, and maybe to try to both prioritize and to try to understand through what channels they can be addressed. So just from personal point of view, we've worked on a lot of projects in different countries to try to, rather than politicize market access and trying to sort of target everything that is out there in a partner's market, to try to actually understand what are some of the priority issues and how they could be addressed. So I would say that the methodologies and trying to critically assess what they have available in government to assess those is something that has been done well.
Thank you very much for that. Just check if Mustafa, if you want to come in on this one. If not, we'll pass on to the chair.
Thanks, Stephen. Yeah, nothing really to add. And it's not really an area of my expertise, to be honest. So,
sure. Okay.
Yeah,
that's great. Okay. Well, thanks very much, all of you, for your answers. And back to you, Henry.
Stephen, thank you very much indeed. Now we turn to Jeff Mackey.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good morning, everyone. Really interesting session so far. If I could just be a little bit more pragmatic from my perspective, I'm really interested in the process regarding formulating policies on trade. So the question of how policy is informed using industrial strategy, and also the links with stakeholders, the devolved governments, and indeed the business voices, is what I'd like to just examine for a few minutes, if that's all right. Marco, you'd already mentioned alignment. Could I start with you, please?
Absolutely, Jeff. And the recent history of the way in which policy has been developed is somewhat questionable because of a lack of integration across government and a sense of a real trajectory and direction of what we want for the UK economy and for businesses. A lack of understanding of our priorities, or a proper integration with regards to our fiscal financial approach, as well as our policy and regulatory environment. Hopeful that the creation of a new department will help address some of those issues, but even in doing that, there has to be clear input and engagement from the regions and the nations of the United Kingdom, and a genuine engagement with the business sector, and that's businesses of all sides, because we can't just focus on the large multinationals or even the medium-sized enterprise. We've got to be conscious of the fact that the next medium-sized business and large business is going to be a micro business or a small business right now. So that there has to be a genuine understanding across government of what our industrial, our import and our export approach is going to be, and then have a stable environment. Because as Sally has said, for businesses to respond to a changing environment, it takes them a few years to really integrate those changes. So there is a period of stability and a proper cross-governmental approach. And just as a plug, we issued a research paper last year which highlighted that there should be a cross-government committee focused on what our trade policy is going to be, pulling on all the strands of the totality of government, because all government departments have a role to play.
Thank you very much, Marco. I'll shy away from any remark about moving the chairs. That gives the definition of progress. Michael, you'd actually mentioned industry and sector. Would you like to pick that theme up with the voices in the sectors and industries and not forgetting the devolved governments, because that gives a different filter to the conversation, please.
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's hard not to agree that the government needs to work closely in the formulation of its policies with key stakeholders. And clearly that includes the business community, and that shouldn't just be the large businesses, it should also be the SMEs. But I would also add to that that there are other stakeholders which the government should also be engaging with, such as consumers and TUC and so on. So if you look at, for example, the DIT's trade advisory groups, it has a whole range of trade advisory groups which supposedly feed into the formulation of trade policy. They are almost universally dominated by business representation. They've got very little representation from consumer groups, very little representation from worker groups or from the TUC and so on, and almost no representation, forgive me, I wave the flag, from, if you like, independent academic groups that might feed into that process. So I think consultation is incredibly important. I'm not sure that the government at the moment does it as comprehensively and as well as it could. When it comes to individual free trade agreements, the government engages in these consultation exercises, and it's got sort of two categories of these. It's got a slightly fuller category for new agreements, it's got a slightly lower category for renewal of agreements, where it asks for submissions into the consultation exercise. I think it's hard to know to what extent these consultations are formulaic and are there because it's felt that they ought to be there, and to what extent the government is actually listening to those responses. It would be very interesting to know if, as a result of those consultations, government policy, what it has tried to negotiate, what it has negotiated, has changed or not. So I think the consultation process could be better than it currently is.
Which is a good place to finish on. Professor Gamage, I'll shy away from the words Claire. Could we just come to you now as part of this conversation? You also talked about things like ESG metrics, and you brought in all sorts of pieces of that jigsaw. How do we bring these voices to inform trade policy when I want to talk about industry?
It's a tricky one. I think that the consultation is key, and consultation and participatory processes in the design and development of trade policy is really important. How you actually mobilize that, I think, is a different matter. It's very complex. I think there has to be this kind of feed-in process of the regional through to the national, and within that you want stakeholders from different backgrounds, not just businesses, but also civil society organizations who may well be able to tell you about certain impacts, that people within the locality have. So if we talk about consumers, for example, within specific parts of the UK, we know that the consumer base will have quite different needs and interests, and those civil society groups may be able to feed into that and to explain where we have a more rights-based concern, for example, around levels of poverty, for example. In our major cities, we may have, lots of economic growth. We also still have very high levels of poverty. There are also, it's very divided in our cities, and then we get to the rural areas, which are affected in an even different way. So I think the consultation and participatory processes need different groups involved. You have groups like Trade Justice Movement, for example. They're a group that should absolutely be involved in terms of sort of external and internal policies. And in terms of the design of those processes, I think you need to start bringing in stakeholders that are maybe not always traditionally around the table. And the way to do that is to go out into the localities and to find out which groups are representing the interests of the people within those areas, and to ask them to talk. When I've reached out to people as part of funded research, they're more than happy to talk to us. But the one thing they say is, we don't have a link into government. We've got no link into DIT. We've got no link into these sort of groups to tell them what the problems are that people in our constituent areas are actually experiencing. So I think that it needs to sort of be about broadening the participatory base. And around ESG, it's about actually looking through different optics at the data that we're given, and not always just taking it as sort of, that it must be a sustainable thing or environmentally good thing, because, that battery, that British Volt one is a good example. Yes, it's making electric vehicles. Yes, that will be good for climate change, but there are other things happening down the supply chain that might not be quite so good. So it's having that holistic view of something as well when we're starting to develop these kind of sort of indicator-based assessments, but also consultatory processes.
Thank you very much. That really was useful. Mustafa, we're talking about different voices, and where do the devolved administrations come into this? Because the voices are different from all sorts of directions from your perspective. My timing's always perfect, Mustafa. I think you've left us briefly.
Yeah, first just to say I really... Oh, okay. I think my connection is very weak. I don't know if you can still hear me.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Can you hear me right now, Jeff?
We'll give it a go. Give it a go.
Yes. Sorry about that. Yeah, my
we can hear you.
Playing up. Just to say, brilliant, excellent. Just to say, first everything that Claire said, I think really powerfully. So I think it's a really good point, because what you have is a relatively unique governance structure in the United Kingdom. Yes, there are sort of federal states around the world, but also what that means is that the kind of leverage and the relationships in terms of international trade that you have here don't just obviously happen with the central government, what they control. And so I think linking to what Claire said is, again, yes, recognizing the gaps in adequate inclusion of those perspectives into so much of the impacts of trade, of international business activity happens at a very local level. And at the same time, also using that as an opportunity to educate people about some of the impacts which may not have been thought about, but of course also can actually have an impact practically in terms of trade. So I mean, a really simple example is, sort of Claire talked about this with the electric batteries and that industry really growing in the United Kingdom. Well, the supply chain, as we know, largely coming from Congo in Africa, where there is a really appalling situation in terms of labor rights and human rights. Something that actually really needs to be addressed in those terms, but also can actually have issues for reliability of the supply chain. And so, it really is about having that integrated approach, having all stakeholders involved, including, of course, these devolved authorities and, of course, in the regions as well. Really, really important.
Thank you very much. Michael, you wanted to come back on this one.
Thank you. Yes, I just wanted to add one more point. I agree very much with what Mustafa and Claire have been saying about the importance of participatory processes and the importance of listening to the concerns of stakeholders, consumers, regions, and so on. But what's also important is, and this is very much a feature of free trade agreements, is that they involve negotiating one thing against another thing. They cover a wide range of areas. So it's also important to understand the sorts of trade-offs that people, stakeholders, businesses in the UK may want or may be prepared to accept. We saw the classic debate when we signed the Australia agreement and New Zealand agreement about, okay, so we've got access to the Australian market, but we're giving up access, or we're giving them much more access to agricultural goods. That's the kind of trade-off that we need to think about, and the government needs to consult on as to what is acceptable and what is needed for the country.
Thank you very much. You open up as regards the industrial strategy and the voices in policy, please.
I can definitely second a lot of the points made already. Mine referred mostly to what Michael said earlier, which I think is having run a lot of consultations on behalf of the European Commission and UK government, it's really for businesses to understand, not just for businesses, but consumer organizations and other groups to understand how their concerns and comments have been actually factored in. I think there is a little bit of a fatigue, especially amongst businesses, especially in this period of many different initiatives are taking place, many different negotiations, and we're constantly asking businesses for feedback. And of course, part of their policy participation is to provide that, but it's really the process of how it then gets considered how it gets through the internal machinery of government and what actually happens with this information, because businesses in some other systems are very essential in how they provide information about, let's say, market access barriers, investment opportunities from trade agreements. And it is really about getting them on board and explaining what is the way through which those processes that also Michael described happened, that their considerations are taken into account. So I would say business fatigue and clarity on how input from different organizations is used.
Thank you very much. The question of prioritization is one for all of us. Sally, is the last word on this question, as possibly a collegiate view from your perspective, given you've got company. Could we actually just pick this one up as regards engagement?
Yeah, Leo is really keen to ensure that the voice of the cat food sector is heard loud and clear. Please forgive me. So from my perspective, there are, as the collegiate voice, there are places where engagement is happening really well. I do think engagement with services businesses is decent. I think that the thematic working groups are working pretty well. I'm very unsure about what some of the other groups are for and do. The trade advisory groups and the STAG and the Board of Trade are somewhat opaque to me as to what they're for and why they exist and what output is needed for them. So really, in terms of business and collegiate and industrial policy and trade policy, it's quite hard to say that it's systematically joined up.
Thanks, Sally. Marco.
To Sally's point, I think that there's a real challenge of that coordination of engagement with stakeholders, in that you get different departments asking slightly different questions on the same theme, going out at the same time, and even within departments asking repeatedly for feedback and input, which is challenging for businesses, particularly to get the MSMEs engaged with, and you end up with a disconnect, and the businesses not engaging with the process fully because of that lack of coordination across the piece. It's certainly one of the challenges we've had, being asked repeatedly by different areas of government for input and insight, but on the same subject, but slightly different angles, and it I think leads either to a disengagement from business or a contradictory piece of evidence being given in for government to try and draw its conclusions.
Thank you very much. I think in conclusion, from my perspective, what I've heard is that for those of us who are old-fashioned, the report says can do better. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you very much indeed, Jeff. Our next questioner is Claire Hanna. Claire, over to you.
Thank you very much, Chair, and apologies for being trigger happy earlier. I was just so keen to get in and discuss it. I wanted to ask about whether or not the panel think that trade with the EU should be handled in the same space and in the same methods as trade with other nations, and does the framework that the government use for trade deal pay sufficient attention to gravity and proximity in trade? I'll start with you, Sally. I'm not just biased working with my name, but to cats as well.
So the short answer is yes. EU trade and rest of world trade should absolutely be handled together in the same department, which of course is likely to happen post the machinery of government changes announced on the 7th of February. But there's no difference now from a conceptual technical perspective, and they need to be joined up. Does the government pay sufficient attention to gravity in trade? I suspect that the priorities to date have been more politically and practically driven than from a gravity perspective, would be the best answer, and more attention could be paid to gravity in that regard.
Thank you. Michael, I see you have your hand up there.
Thank you. Yeah, fairly briefly on this. The answer to the first part of the question is unambiguously yes. There's absolutely no reason for this to be separated, and as Sally has said, it looks like that's the direction we're moving in. You know, to date, I think trade policy making has been somewhat disjointed across different government departments, let alone, in terms of its coherence with industrial strategy. And therefore, I think from that perspective, potentially what was announced this week is probably a good idea. With regard to the question about gravity, on a technical level, are government officials aware of the role of gravity in trade, and do they take it into account in the work that they do, in the empirical work that they do? Yes, absolutely, they're very well aware of it. But I think the question is probably asking something broader than that, which is, does the government at a higher, sort of more political level, recognize that trade is largely a function of the size of the partner you're trading with and the distance from that partner? And given the lack of emphasis on trying to improve relations with the EU, which is after all our closest and biggest trading partner, it's hard not to conclude that they probably do not pay enough attention to gravity.
Okay, thank you very much. Mustafa, did you want to come in there?
And no, not really. It's not really an area of my expertise, so no. Thank you for asking, though.
Claire?
Yeah, sure. I mean, my personal view aligns with that of Michael's, that I think that they have not taken into account sufficiently, the nature of the relationship with the EU. I think that perhaps the politicized nature of exiting the EU has perhaps clouded the fact that the EU is still our major trading partner, and we are still deeply embedded within global value chains within that space. And there's nothing to be ashamed of in saying that. And actually what we need to be doing, I think, is looking to strengthen that relationship, to unashamedly saying, do you know what, this is our biggest trading partner. We may not be part of the EU anymore, but that doesn't mean that we're not important to the EU and the EU is important to us. And so I think going forward, what would be good to see is sort of a refreshed and renewed commitment to trying to resolve some of the challenges that have existed around that Northern Ireland Protocol, to being able to see sort of the business trends, the business being made easier for those companies to get their goods in and out, for services to move more freely within those spaces, notwithstanding that very challenging question of Northern Ireland that still hangs over us and how we treat that particular space. But I do think that within this, what we've seen is that, trade fluctuation with the EU hasn't been that significant, which means that actually it's still really important to us, and we need to start nurturing those relationships a bit more.
A consensus around the same principles and approach, but calibrated slightly differently. Marco, could you want to come in on that as well?
Yes, and if you look at the trade flows, the trade flows from the EU into the UK, although are down, haven't been hit as hard as the exports from the UK into the EU. And part of that is because we haven't fully implemented the requirements of the agreement. And I think there are significant challenges that the UK will face, business will face, as and when those rules, regulations are fully implemented. So I think there's an awful lot that needs to be done at pace to ease and smooth the relationship with the EU, because we are fundamentally integrated with regards to our supply chains and our value chains, and that isn't going to change in the short term. So I think that there needs to be a prioritization of the EU, but absolutely echoing Sally's point, the EU and rest of the world has to be treated in the one space with the one overview and approach, because otherwise we'll get even greater confusion and potential for a lack of comprehensive, coherent strategy.
Thank you very much. Lisa, did you want to have a final word there before I hand back to the chair?
Second what Marco said, especially in view of the potential modification and monitoring also of the TCA. So we know that 2025 is possibly the first date when we're going to be discussing the TCA more actively in terms of what are going to be the priority areas for both sides. So the machinery across government of the different topics which will be covered in this TCA modifications has to work jointly. So there has to be coherence, and there should be also, I think we mentioned sort of an agreement across also government, but more broadly on which areas are important for the UK for regulatory autonomy purposes, and which ones it could stay aligned with broadly with what the EU has been doing, and this has to be dealt with within the same space, within the same department. And predominantly, as somebody mentioned, CBAM earlier. So these are all issues where we have to sort of exactly balance between autonomy and some sort of broader realization where we want to stay closer when it comes to geography and regulation.
Thank you very much. It's all really, really interesting. And I'll hand back to you, please, Chair.
Thank you very much indeed. The next question is coming from Tamara Chinchik. Tamara, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. So my question is the UK doing enough for developing countries in its trade policy? In particular, is there a risk of preference erosion from deals with major agricultural economies? Mustafa, if I could start with you, please.
Sure. Thanks, Tamara. So we don't obviously cover the details of the broader aspects of the trade relations, but the broad point that I will say is, as I said earlier, is there is seeming to be an erosion of the prioritization of human rights and labor rights in the trade negotiations, which does have a flow-on effect in terms of support for these developing economies, because that actually is an area where there is both potential lineup between the trade relations and, of course, respecting human rights and labor rights. The obvious point is that so much of our supply chains, we can think about particularly things like agriculture, but even if you think of the service sector, you think about the apps that we use at the moment, any kind of digital support that we might get, so much of that is outsourced to these countries. A lot of our work at the moment that we're doing is around gendered harm, around workplace issues that people are facing. And so there is a real opportunity there. I don't want to answer the question as saying, no, it's not doing enough, or yes, it is. Obviously, it's not binary. And I know the question is more nuanced than that. But again, not to avoid the real challenges that we're seeing there, but again, to frame it in a positive way in terms of opportunity. It is to say that it is where the UK can use its leverage. There's a value that can be gained from doing that. But certainly, I think so far it has been, certainly in the areas that we look at. We do a lot of work in South Asia, Southeast Asia, in East and South Africa, those regions of the world, looking back at obviously large corporations in the UK and in the global north. And it has been fairly disappointing to sort of see the correlation between the kinds of impacts that you're seeing and the nature of these trade negotiations, the things that are focused on.
So arguably there's been a sense of trade at any cost. Mustafa, is that your concern?
So I'd say absolutely. This idea that, look, we have to be making sure that we, sort of reach these agreements, that there is sort of an economic imperative measured in a very short-term but absolute way. But also, this common issue of seeing a human rights, labor rights measure as being the luxury, the sort of the cherry on top.
Yeah.
Then number one being integral, but also that you can actually integrate that. And, if that sounds like it's very academic, if you talk to, British investors, if you talk to the biggest companies in the United Kingdom, those are conversations that they're talking about. These are FTSE 500 companies that, often we're in touch with them because a lot of our work is supply chain investigations. So it's about the evidence base that we gather. And often they're ahead of the curve. Now, that's not unusual. That's not just the UK. That's in lots of countries. And it's not surprising. Obviously, the world has changed. That often that business is leading in some aspects of human rights and labor rights. But absolutely, I think you're right.
Yeah, that nuance of ESG targets being an expectation of investors and that perhaps being something that needs to be forefront in trade deals is very pertinent. Thank you, Mustafa. Claire, if I could ask the same question to you as well, please.
Sure. So just to move outside of the FTA context, I suppose, because, Mustafa's answered quite a lot on that already. In terms of the other way that the UK engages with developing countries is through its developing country trading scheme. And, you know, we're waiting for the text of that, which I understand will be published later this month if it's on time. But, you know, the DCTS has gone a long way to revising some of the challenges, I suppose, that are associated with the EU's generalised system of preferences. And it will be interesting to see once it's actually properly implemented, whether it yields the benefits that we hope that it will. And, you know, I mean, I think the relaxation of the vulnerability criteria, for example, is a positive step forward. There is that question around whether removing that requirement to sign and ratify and implement the conventions is a good or a bad thing. But it does mean that that focus on export diversification perhaps brings more countries within the scope of that preference level, which is a positive thing. And of course, it reserves the right to use sanctions where appropriate. So I think that the DCTS seems like an interesting revision to what had existed beforehand. And I will certainly be watching that one very closely to see whether it does yield those positive outcomes that we hope that it will. The other way that the UK is, I think, and has been leading in terms of supporting developing countries is around aid for trade. And we see a significant financial flow coming out either through pure government funding or through blended finance, through BII, through British Investment Partnerships. And I think that we shouldn't diminish the significance of those projects. They are projects, they're programs that are operating, you know, within very specific contexts, but they can be very meaningful to the communities in those developing countries that are receiving the financial support to build capacity and to enable them to integrate that particular part of a supply chain or that particular sector into another supply chain. So I think there is a lot being done, but I would hesitate to say that I think that the UK is, you know, not able to do more in its work with developing countries. I think there is a lot more that can be done, as I've mentioned earlier, so I won't restate that around what it could do in the context of FTAs. I think the FTAs fall short on what the UK should be doing with developing countries. What we do know is just to add in terms of what we do know from the enabling clause, from the time that it was introduced in the late 70s at the WTO to now, not many of those countries have integrated into the global economy. So we know that the models that have existed for a long time have not really worked very well.
Thank you, Claire. I can see two hands up, but I just wanted to ask this of Elitza before I go to the two hands that I can see up.
Great, thank you so much, Tamara. So for me, just briefly, so for me, two things would be really important here. One is we know the key issue with the existing relationship between while we were part of the European Union in terms of the economic partnership agreements. We know extensively of their drawbacks, and particularly in terms of the fragmentation and the approach that it had towards the continent. And I think that one of the main things that will be important is to see whether the policies that will be taken over the next years will try to move away from such an approach, which focuses on fragmentation, which for me will be one of the things to look at. And then the second thing is also on the multilateral level. So I think that that's a little bit with the current global context, with the US going and doing its own thing, with the UN going and doing its own thing. There is a little bit of fear that developing countries will be slightly left out in the climate transformation with all of the activities and all of the investment that has to take place in order for developing countries to take part in this transformation. And I think that what the UK has done really well, and that links to Claire's point, is to be a really good champion at the multilateral level at the engagement of developing countries and bringing together agreement on some of the issues that are particularly important to them. So subsidies, fisheries, rules around the digital that could really help some of the spurring some of the innovation and also some of the engagement of countries, developing countries in global value chains, which we know is still lacking. So these are all things which are our priority for the UK government already, and they're also very important for developing countries. So there is a natural, I think, symphony there for them to come closer together and for the UK to be a really a good champion at the multilateral level. And then lastly, maybe I think, just to mention the climate friendly incentives that are also should be part of any future schemes.
Thank you. And it's Marco, I see your hands up.
Thank you, Tamara. I think we need to separate the diplomatic piece, where I think the UK does really well in the organisations like the WTO and being an advocate for supporting and engaging with the developing world, and the DCTS does seem like it's a very positive move, particularly for the African nations, where accumulation will enable that intra-African trade to support the trade with the UK. I was at a reception with some of the African High Commissioners yesterday evening, and it's clear that although we seem to be getting the diplomatic bit right and some of the process and policy levels right, what we're not doing is actually generating the trade to support that and goes behind that. So DCTS coming on stream, but is there the knowledge and understanding either side of how to exploit the opportunities that exist and generate trade actually happening? Talking to the High Commissioner for Nigeria, he was aghast that they are a nation that see the UK as their priority trading partner, but the investment and engagement with Nigeria is dropping off a cliff. We've gone from being the largest investor in Nigeria to the fifth, behind the Chinese, the Germans, and even the Dutch. I think that there has to be a really clear sense of a government approach to engage effectively, actually, with the developing nations, and also supporting countries like Bangladesh losing its LDC status. What that actually is going to mean, there's a significant challenge for Bangladesh. What is the UK government doing to help and support that transition? So I think there are some very big questions as to how we are leveraging not just our soft power, but our practical force and investment capabilities.
Yeah, it's about the vision piece, I think, there. Thank you. Michael, you're my last hand up before I go back to the chair.
Thank you. Let me focus a little bit on this issue of preference erosion. So preference erosion is typically in the context of tariffs on trading goods, and where the UK has given preferences to developing countries, and will they get eroded as it signs free trade agreements with other countries? Now, by and large, UK tariffs are low already across a very wide range of goods. I guess the sectors where we typically think of where tariffs are higher and where preference erosion may be a more important issue are to do with agricultural trade and probably textiles and clothing. Clearly, there is some risk that if we sign free trade deals with certain partner countries, there might be some degree of preference erosion. I don't know the answer, the extent to which that is the case, but I would make the point that it's something that's eminently calculable. It's not difficult to work out if we sign a free trade agreement which completely liberalizes trade, for example, with India or hypothetically Brazil or whatever, what that might mean for developing countries. So it is something that it is not that difficult to try and assess. There's another aspect of preference erosion, and I'm picking up now on the discussions about the DCTS, because the DCTS is changing the relative degree of preferential access between different types of developing countries, between the least developed countries and the non-least developed countries, to put it fairly simply. So there is a danger here that the DCTS will involve some preference erosion for the least developed countries, in comparison to the previous UK's GSP scheme. Now, we have been doing some work on this. In fact, we'll be shortly publishing something on this. And in fact, the evidence suggests there's very little risk of preference erosion from that. So I think the reforms to the DCTS scheme generally, I think, are good. It doesn't look like it'll impact very much in terms of preference erosion on least developed countries. Two of the reforms that are, I think, a positive feature of the DCTS are the generous accumulation rules and the actual product-specific rules of origin that have been introduced in the DCTS are generally less constraining than the preceding rules of origin that were in the GSP scheme, and that's a good thing. That leads me on to my next point, which is in the free trade agreements that the UK signs, there is the possibility of agreeing with the partner countries whether diagonal accumulation with developing or least developing countries would be allowed as well. And I think it's either the Australia or the New Zealand agreement. I confess I can't remember which one of those has the possibility of that provision. And I think that's an interesting, it's the first time I've seen that in a free trade agreement, and I think that's an interesting and innovative addition to a free trade agreement. And then my final point is that there's only a limited amount that you can do with preferences. And this goes back to what various of the other contributors have been saying about the need for aid for trade across a whole range of other areas. We spend a lot of time talking about, in terms of our own trade policy, how, well, tariffs aren't really the big barriers, if non-tariff barriers to trade. So this is, and regulatory barriers to trade. So this is where aid for trade policies can potentially at least help developing countries, or at least developed countries, understand what those regulatory barriers are and start to move towards perhaps dealing with those regulatory barriers.
Thank you so much, Michael. Over to you, Chair.
Tamara, thank you very much indeed. Just before I turn to Mike Cohen, who's going to ask the last question, can I just go back to the point that was raised a little earlier about the fact that the British government has not yet implemented checks, full checks on goods coming into the UK from the European Union. And I just wondered if any of you had a view on what the balance of argument is that you think is going on in government over that. And as and when and if those checks are implemented, what impact do you think that might have on the EU's view of the need to improve the trade and cooperation agreement? I don't know if anyone would like to offer a view on that. Crumbs, it's stunned silence. Why does anyone think that the government's delayed the introduction of those full checks? What's that about? Well, this is most unusual for the UK Trade and Business Commission, I have to tell you. Marco.
I think that the challenge is that those are political decisions that are being taken, and so it would be difficult to try and second guess the rationale as to why those decisions have been taken, and it would be speculation, certainly on our part, as to what the motivations are, or indeed what the reactions could be as and when those checks are implemented. So I can understand why there's a slight reticence to answer. Oh, Michael, I will leave you to.
Cheers.
I don't
Michael,
have
over to you.
Chair, I don't have a clear answer to your question. Yeah. My understanding is that it's partly political, but partly a question of the physical infrastructure available at the ports. Yeah. They're just simply not yet ready, both physically and in terms of possibly even technological infrastructure, to deal with those sorts of checks, as well as worrying about the impact on UK businesses, or producers, I should say, because this is largely to do with agricultural and agri-food products. What I would say, and this possibly is different to what Marco said earlier, and I'd be very interested in following up with you, Marco, if I misunderstood you. But from the work that we have done on UK trade flows with the EU in goods, what appears to be fairly unambiguously the case is that in most sectors, UK exports to the EU relative to the non-EU have by and large recovered. There's no particular evidence that UK is doing worse in exporting to the EU relative to the non-EU. It is true that in aggregate, UK exports are lower than comparator countries, if you look at the work of John Springford and so on. But if you're comparing what's happened to the EU versus non-EU, there are some sectors that have been very badly hit: leather, footwear, textiles, and a bit of agri-food. But in aggregate, UK exports are by and large recovered. That's not true of imports. Imports of goods and services are of the order of 20% down from the EU in comparison to non-EU countries. That's quite surprising, especially given that the government hasn't introduced some of these checks that we've just been talking about. It's not quite what one would expect. But that's what the evidence, while we're trying to control for everything that we possibly can, including COVID and so on, appears to be showing.
That is very, very interesting. Well, we will no doubt return to this. So I'm now going to move to Mike Cohen to ask the final question of all of you. Mike, over to you.
Thank you. Yes, so the final question, inevitably, I'm going to be asking for something of a summary, I suppose. We're looking at the frameworks within which trade deals happen today. So thinking very broadly about what we want to achieve from trade deals and how they should be conducted. I'd like to ask for 3 policy recommendations to government that you would make, had you the chance. It'd be lovely to hear from everybody if we have the time on that, but perhaps Claire could start us off and then we'll see who fancies putting a hand up.
Sure, thank you very much. I'll try and keep it brief so everyone's got an opportunity to speak. My first policy recommendation goes back to one of the first things I said in terms of, I think that the UK needs to decide what its trade policy actually is. What is this policy going to be? And that's not just about, you know, the economic side of that. What values does the UK want to embed or have as part of its trade strategy? And actually, if it turns around and says we don't want any values at all, then so be it. But there needs to be some kind of decisive and conclusive step towards what is the UK trade strategy. So that's my first one. The second one would be that I think there needs to be a deeper exploration into how we make those linkages between the external trade policy and the internal industrial policy. How do those two connect? How do they feed into one another? And how do they relate to one another? My third and final plea to the government would be not to abandon a rights-based approach to trade policy. And it would be to say, please carefully re-examine this step back from that. Yes, there is this question mark around whether it's the right policy framework to be using, but to look at the ways in which rights could be promoted through the external and internal dimensions of trade policy. So I'll leave it there for others to speak.
Thank you very much. I don't see any hands, but I'm sure somebody would like to make some recommendations. Michael, can I go to you? And then I've got Mustafa, then Sam.
Okay, this is a tough question. If you ask me tomorrow, I might give you a different set of 3 things. But let me go with what I have for today. I very much agree with what Claire said about a need to clearly articulate a trade strategy and then link it to a domestic strategy and domestic industrial strategy. One of the big challenges facing the UK economy is a lack of productivity and productivity growth. We need a strategy that addresses that, and we need a strategy in trade that helps to address that. In particular, given the challenges that we mentioned earlier going on in terms of increasing intervention by other countries in trade policy. To my mind, that means a much more focused policy on specific areas and sectors. You know, we're not going to become a major battery producer, a major semiconductor chip producer. This involves niche specialization and thinking about the policies that will support niche specialization. Related to that, and this is actually related, I realized to the point I made 2 minutes ago in response to the earlier question, increasingly the key barriers to trade are not about tariffs, but about regulatory barriers. So the government needs to think carefully about what are the key regulatory barriers in the sectors that it is interested in, be this manufacturing or services, and how best to use free trade agreements to ease and facilitate those trade barriers. My third recommendation is focusing on a much broader issue that I think the UK economy and the world economy faces, which is that of climate change. And I think the UK needs to think very, very hard about what is its policy, its international policy towards climate change, to CBAMs and so on, and how it can support a transition to a low carbon economy. I would put that as probably the top priority. And I know I'm not allowed the fourth, but the fourth is we need certainty. We don't need instability. That's what impacts negatively on investment and so on. So all this constant change of policy, for example, things like the retained EU law bill, is all leading to uncertainty, which is not good for UK trade and investment.
Thank you very much. I had Mustafa's hand next.
Thanks, Mike. Just 3 points very, very quickly. recognizing these things are complex, as Michael has mentioned. But firstly, these agreements should contain enforceable human rights protections. They must be based on independent independent human rights and environment risk assessments and ongoing due diligence mechanisms. You have the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, standards that business are already applying. So, we're not talking about sort of reinventing things. And then finally, something others touched on as well is setting up enforcement mechanisms on labor rights, human rights, and environmental issues in all future UK trade treaties. It goes on what we talked about earlier, that no, they're not a panacea, these trade agreements, even if they integrate human rights, labor rights into them, but they're an opening point, and it's an ongoing matter to be monitoring respect for that. It's an important leverage point, and there are benefits to respecting human rights and labor rights, even from a trade perspective, I'd argue.
Thank you very much. Could I go to Sally next, please?
Yes, and it's not so much a policy recommendation, because I agree with everybody else's recommendations so far. It's more of a plea, which is to focus on the practical. And if I were to break that down into 3 areas, it would be that the hard technical grind of implementation is so important and mustn't be overlooked. It would be a plea to stop the EU retained law bill, and certainly its 31 December 2023 deadline, because the risk of disruption to business from unintended consequences is absolutely vast. And then the third would be to publish the CBAM and semiconductor strategies, which are 2 areas of policy that are critically important to British business.
Thank you very much. Elisa, please.
I can very clearly follow up from Sally's point, because this is exactly what I wanted to focus on as well. So the linkages to other policy areas, particularly the 2 that I have mentioned before. So national security and economic coercion more broadly, but also the climate transformation. So exactly those two policies that Sally mentioned are definitely a priority. And I also put equally with that, of course, inclusive trade policy that both Mustafa and Claire mentioned, in terms of both women-centered, but also diversity-centered, in terms of making sure that we cover all of those rights that we find important. And finally, I would say, even though it is mostly oriented towards FTAs, let's not forget that we can still try to bring some impetus on the multilateral level, and trying to make sure the things that we do in our unilateral and bilateral engagement doesn't in some ways hurt that. So these are my 3.
Thank you very much. And I'll go to Marco to have the last word.
So in summary, I support the key points that have been made. So I won't focus on policy, more on attitude and approach. And I think it's the government needs to have a long-term view of what the approach to trade is going to be. That's imports, exports, and our global role. And that we need to put and leverage our soft power, but show commitment as well. I think that there is a significant issue around UK skills, and I'm talking not just about productivity skills, but actually around business leaders seeing international trade as just a part of doing business, rather than a challenge or difficulty that they will get to. So I think we need to look at how we are developing the next generation of business leaders who see themselves as having a role to play internationally. And the third point I'd make is a plea to ensure that, with regards to any policy that's being considered by UK government that impacts trade, that there is a full, comprehensive engagement on both a regional, devolved nation and business and civil society level, to ensure that what is being proposed is going to have the impact that we hope and expect, and we avoid the sometimes lack of understanding or realization of what the rules and regulations really are.
Thank you very much, and I'll hand back to the chair.
Well, Mike, thank you very much indeed.
Look, on behalf of all of the commissioners and everybody watching, can I thank our witnesses today? I think that's been absolutely a cracking session, and we finished almost exactly on time. So thank you for making that possible. And we shall be reflecting on what you've had to say today and other evidence sessions we shall be holding in drawing up further recommendations for the Commission as to what the UK can do better to improve our trade and economic growth and help the country in general. But thank you so much for joining us today. And with that, I declare this evidence session finished. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.